There are wars that don't begin with an explosion, but with a terrifying silence. When thousands of speedboats appear on the surface of the Persian Gulf, when a U.S. supercarrier enters the narrowest waters in the world, and when both sides know that a single mistake could ignite a regional catastrophe, the question is no longer who is stronger, but who dares to go further. Does Iran truly have the capability to strike the USS Abraham Lincoln, or is this all just a carefully calculated game of deterrence? If you're drawn to slow, deep, non-sensational geopolitical analysis, consider subscribing to this channel now, because what's unfolding in the Persian Gulf could shape the entire Middle East in the days to come. At that moment, the Persian Gulf was not filled with explosions, declarations of war, or blaring red headlines on international media. What hung over the sea was a heavy silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like even the smallest collision could set off the whole space. Through that narrow, scorching stretch of water, thick with the scent of oil, a giant steel shadow quietly advanced. The USS Abraham Lincoln, a U.S. supercarrier, didn't need fanfare to prove its might. Its very presence was the message: power, deterrence, and absolute punitive capability. But right there, in that very place, the familiar rules of warfare began to blur. Not because America had grown weaker, but because the battlefield itself had changed. As the Lincoln moved through narrow sea lanes where the distance between shoreline and battle formation could be measured in mere nautical miles, its high-tech superiority suddenly had to contend with a frustrating new reality. The space was too tight to showcase its strength in traditional ways. Here, power was no longer measured solely by how many jets were on deck or how many missiles sat in their launch tubes, but by how well one could handle threats that were small, cheap, numerous, and suffocatingly close. From afar, no one could see Iranian warships drawing near. What appeared first were just tiny specks on the water, then more, then hundreds, fast, low-profile speedboats darting and scattered, moving as if without formation. No grand flags, no intimidating formations, just numbers, and it was those numbers that made command centers hold their breath. This wasn't the opening scene of old-school naval battle. This felt like the moment before a storm, when no one could be sure where the first strike would come from, when it would hit, or what form it might take. The key thing to understand is this isn't just about Iran threatening the US. It's not some muscle-flexing stunt for the evening news. What's being tested in the Persian Gulf is the very logic of maritime deterrence in the modern age. Can a symbol of absolute power, a supercarrier, still hold psychological dominance when faced with threats that don't play by symmetrical rules? Can advanced technology truly dominate when forced to respond to hundreds of cheap, dispersed, and sacrificial targets? So the central question isn't whether Iran can sink a supercarrier. Tehran likely understands that's almost impossible. The far scarier question is, do they even need to? Or would it be enough to make that symbol hesitate, waver, or fail to act in the very role it was built to play? And when we look deeper into the picture, it becomes clear that those speedboats aren't just heading out to sea. They reflect a different reality, one rooted deep inside Iranian soil, a nation under pressure, a regime on the edge of survival, a place where traditional options are closing off. When a country can no longer compete in conventional ways, the extreme path isn't just a rash decision. It's the outcome of a cold, calculated survival logic. And that's where the real story begins, across the water, inside Iran, where every reckless decision is colored by the will to survive. From the outside, Iran still seems to stand tall, defiant, unyielding, and constantly projecting an image of resistance. But behind that hardened shell lies a very different reality, the feeling of being pushed to the edge of the chessboard. The economy has been worn down by years of sanctions, the currency has lost its value, eroding layers of social stability, and daily life has become so strained that protests are no longer outliers. They've become a recurring pulse. Every time chants echo through the streets of Tehran or Mashhad, they're not just reactions to gas prices or inflation, they're signs of a fractured social contract. In that context, power in Iran no longer operates with the confidence of a regime expanding its influence. It has shifted into a defensive posture. The supreme leader appears less frequently. Survival decisions are made deep within tight inner circles. where the priority is no longer achieving grand victories, but simply avoiding collapse. When a regime no longer believes it can win in peacetime, it begins to raise the value of deterrence through tension. In that logic, crisis isn't something to be avoided. It becomes a tool to buy time, reposition the regime, and force the adversary to rethink their calculations. Iran knows its limits well. A head-on confrontation with the US, whether in the air or at sea, would be near suicidal. Iran's Air Force, even after partial modernization, still lags generations behind the US military's combined capabilities. Its traditional Navy cannot match in operational range, air defense, or coordinated warfare. Above all, America's multi-layered defense system, from satellites to radars to naval strike groups, is designed precisely to crush any symmetrical opponent. Iran doesn't lack resolve. It lacks the space to fight in the normal way. This is where extremity is no longer an emotional choice, but the logical result of being cornered. When every familiar path leads to failure, the only way forward is the one the enemy didn't expect. Iran doesn't seek to become a lesser version of the US, it aims to become a completely different equation. Instead of competing in quality, it shifts to quantity. Instead of seeking clear-cut victories, it works to erode the enemy's confidence in their own calculations. In survival mode, the goal isn't to defeat, it's to make the cost of action unpredictable. Iran doesn't need to win a total war. It only needs to make the US and its allies wonder, is this military presence still worth it? Could a small move trigger a cascade of uncontrollable consequences? When those questions begin to surface in the minds of decision makers, deterrence takes on a new shape. Inside Iran, that strategy carries another purpose: reinforcing legitimacy. In a society under economic and sanction pressure, projecting the ability to stand up to a superpower isn't just for external audiences. It's a message aimed inward. The regime can still defend, still choose, still hasn't reached the point of desperation. Tension with the US, paradoxically, becomes the last adhesive bond between power and loyalty. And from that survival logic, a different kind of warfare begins to take shape. Not one fought with grand fleets or elite squadrons, but with things small, cheap, expendable, and deployed in numbers that can overwhelm even the most sophisticated defense systems. When Iran heads out to sea, it carries no illusion of a glorious, decisive battle. It carries a doctrine where quantity itself becomes a weapon, where controlled chaos is used to wear down technological superiority. This is where the story shifts to a new chapter, the chapter of swarm warfare, where order is challenged not by overwhelming strength, but by calculated overload and disorder. In modern warfare, there are moments when technological superiority doesn't disappear. It just becomes heavy and sluggish. Iran's doctrine of swarm warfare was born out of precisely such a moment. It wasn't written in thick naval textbooks, but emerged from a very simple question. How can a weaker nation force a stronger adversary to lose focus, hesitate, and fall out of rhythm? The answer doesn't lie in creating a perfect weapon, but in creating too many imperfect threats all at once. On the waters of the Persian Gulf, swarm warfare doesn't arrive in majestic formation. It appears more like a wave of deliberate chaos. Small, low-profile, hard-to-detect speedboats race in from multiple directions at high speed. They don't need perfect synchronization or sophisticated coordination like modern fleets. What matters is the feeling of being surrounded, closed in, and pushed into a constant reactive state. A single speedboat may pose no danger to a modern warship, but when their numbers swell into the hundreds, even thousands, they begin to pose a psychological challenge. Iran understands it cannot, and does not need to, directly overpower America's most advanced defense systems. Instead, it aims to push those systems into overload. A modern defense network is like a highly intelligent brain, but one trained to handle clear, orderly, high-value threats. When that brain is bombarded with a storm of cheap, fast, disordered targets, its intelligence becomes a burden. Every interception decision drains time, resources, and most critically, attention. And in warfare, attention is one of the most precious resources of all. The genius of swarm doctrine lies in how it flips the cost equation. A modern interceptor missile can cost tens or even hundreds of times more than a speedboat or a crewed drone. When your adversary is forced to respond to low-cost threats with expensive weapons, the balance is no longer about raw strength. It's about how long your system can endure. Iran isn't chasing a single moment of victory. It's pursuing cumulative fatigue, where every reaction leaves a small crack in command and control. At a deeper level, swarm warfare is a psychological assault on leadership. In an environment where threats come from every direction, at high speed, and in overwhelming numbers, decision makers are forced to shift from proactive thinking to reflexive response. Every second brings new questions. Which target is real? Which is a feint? Is there a second wave waiting behind this one? When the answers are unclear, confidence, the foundation of deterrence, begins to waver. And this doctrine doesn't demand perfection. It embraces loss as a necessary cost. Speedboats destroyed, drones shot down. These are not failures, but data points. Every close approach tests enemy reactions, gauges tempo, measures tolerance, and probes willpower. In this logic, sacrifice doesn't weaken the strategy, it feeds it. The greater the volume, the higher the endurance, and the clearer the message becomes. We can keep going longer than you think. But here, swarm warfare reveals its core paradox. It does not aim to destroy the enemy. It aims to force the enemy to question their own role. When a superpower must spend vast resources countering small threats, the symbolic value of power itself comes under pressure, and no symbol distills that power more clearly than an aircraft carrier. As waves of speedboats rise on the narrow sea, the question is no longer just whether they can cause material damage. The bigger question is, what happens if that symbol of power is forced to step back, slow down, or simply fails to act as expected? From that collision point between small-scale threats and colossal symbolic value, all eyes begin to focus on a specific name, the USS Abraham Lincoln. Is it a mobile fortress, truly untouchable? Or is it a target with such heavy psychological weight that its mere hesitation could shake the very foundation of maritime deterrence? The USS Abraham Lincoln is not just a ship, it's an idea. When that colossal silhouette appears on the sea, the world doesn't simply see steel, aircraft, and radar. It sees an entire power structure that the United States has spent decades building. An aircraft carrier carries with it an unspoken promise. Wherever it appears, order will be imposed, and those who challenge it will pay a price. That's why the true value of the Abraham Lincoln isn't found solely in its combat capabilities, but in the psychological weight it carries. Purely from a military standpoint, sinking an aircraft carrier is an almost impossible task. It doesn't travel alone. It's the core of a multi-layered, multi-dimensional strike group. Air defense, anti-submarine warfare, electronic warfare, early warning systems, all woven into a dense protective network. The ship itself is built to take damage and keep operating, even under attack. In the logic of classical warfare, taking down a target like this requires a decisive, precise, and devastating blow. And Iran knows very well that it does not possess such a blow. But it's here that modern warfare thinking begins to diverge. Iran doesn't need to, and likely never intends to, sink the Abraham Lincoln. Its target isn't total destruction, but symbolic paralysis. In modern warfare, there are victories that don't require sunken hulls. A single strike that disables the flight deck, that interrupts takeoffs and landings, that forces the entire carrier group to alter its plans, that alone is enough to break the strategic function of an aircraft carrier. The concept of a mission kill was born from this logic. You don't need to destroy the enemy. You only need to prevent them from fulfilling their mission. For a carrier, its core mission isn't merely to survive, it's to project power into the sky. When that ability is interrupted, even briefly, the psychological and strategic effects ripple far beyond the physical damage. A symbol of power that can no longer act as a symbol creates a void in the perception of deterrence. And that is precisely why the Abraham Lincoln has become more of a symbolic target than a purely military one. In Iran's eyes, it represents the center of gravity of American willpower. To touch it, even in a limited way, is to send a message that extends far beyond the waters of the Persian Gulf. That message doesn't need to be written in wreckage. It's written in hesitation, in heightened caution, in endless meetings inside command rooms. When a superpower must weigh every move out of fear of asymmetric risk, deterrence begins to take on a new shape. But to turn a symbol into a viable target requires more than will or numbers. It requires information. You need to know where the ship is, how it's moving, what its defensive formation looks like, and when its guard is lowest. At this point, the story shifts to a different front, quiet yet just as decisive, the front of reconnaissance, of drones, of jamming, and real-time data. Without information, every doctrine is just speculation. Without the ability to see and track, every weapon, whether a speedboat or a missile, becomes an arrow shot into darkness. That's why, when the Abraham Lincoln appears like a towering symbol on the sea, the true confrontation isn't just taking place across a few nautical miles. It's unfolding in the invisible realm of intelligence. And that is where another war is quietly taking shape, a war of drones, of electronic warfare, and of surveillance, a domain Iran both desperately desires and significantly lacks. In every modern confrontation scenario, information always precedes firepower. In the waters of the Persian Gulf, where every nautical mile can mean the difference between life and death, the real battle doesn't begin with missiles, but with the question, who sees whom first? That's why drones have become the centerpiece of this era. Cheap, plentiful, easy to deploy, and flexible enough to slip through the gaps traditional systems can't fully cover. They don't need to be perfectly accurate or carry large warheads. They just need to appear, circle, transmit a signal, and in doing so, they fulfill their most crucial task, exposing the rhythm of the enemy. Iran understands this well. In an environment where America's strength lies in coordinated combat and rapid response, disrupting the flow of information is the only way to narrow the gap. Iranian drones fly low, fly slow, sometimes crudely built, but they're used as single-use eyes. Every drone shot down isn't necessarily a failure, but a data point. Which radar activates, which direction is most protected, what blind spots exist in the defensive net. The intelligence gathered from these test runs, though fragmented, is enough to sketch a rough portrait of how the adversary operates. However, it's precisely here that Iran hits its most dangerous limitation. Drones only have real value when they're plugged into a reconnaissance command control system strong enough to process real-time data, and that's what Iran lacks. Without a dense network of military satellites, without stable communications in heavily jammed environments, tracking a mobile target like an aircraft carrier becomes nearly impossible. Every passing minute changes the target's position. Every small error in data can turn a carefully planned strike into a hit on empty sea. Information warfare then becomes a double-edged sword. Iran can make noise, create static, stir uncertainty, but turning that into true military effect requires a level of capability they haven't yet reached. Meanwhile, the US defends not just with firepower, but by dominating the space of perception. Every time a drone is taken down, it's not just a military action, it's a message. We see you, and we control the tempo. The deployment of advanced fighter jets to handle those small targets carries a clear performative weight. Not to show off raw strength, but to underline the gap in situational awareness. When information is incomplete, every offensive doctrine becomes fragile. A strike on a symbolic target like an aircraft carrier, without the backing of precise reconnaissance, risks missing the mark, or worse, hitting but failing to achieve the intended effect. And in warfare, a half-measure strike is often more dangerous than none at all. It exposes intent, triggers retaliation, and strips away the ambiguity that gives the weaker side its leverage. That's why when we look at the information war, we begin to understand why Iran, despite escalating tensions, repeatedly stops short of crossing the line. The absence of information means the absence of control. Without control, every shot fired risks unleashing consequences beyond calculation. And at this point, the real question is no longer whether Iran can fire, but whether it dares to. Because the moment the first missile leaves its launcher, the game of jamming and ambiguity ends, giving way to a chain of reactions with no turning back. It is this fear of losing control that acts as the invisible tether, holding Iran back just before the threshold of action, where that first shot could come at a price they simply cannot afford to pay. At the peak of tension, when every signal suggests that a shot could be fired at any moment, the most striking thing is not the explosion, but the hesitation. Not because Iran lacks the means to stir trouble, nor because it lacks the will to show strength. That hesitation comes from a far colder calculation, the price of the first shot. In the world of modern deterrence, the side that fires first doesn't just trigger a military confrontation. It tears apart the only strategic ambiguity, shielding it from a full-scale response. Iran knows that if it pulls the trigger first, the entire narrative shifts. All previous threats, the speedboats, drones, jamming, can still be interpreted as defensive, reactive, deterrent. But the first shot transforms everything into an unmistakable act of aggression. At that point, Washington no longer has to deliberate. The power of choice shifts to the US, and history shows that when it reacts, it strikes where it hurts most. Infrastructure, the economy, and a regime's ability to hold power. Even a limited strike on a symbolic target could provoke a retaliation far beyond expectation. Iran's oil infrastructure, its economic lifeline, would become a priority target. Command centers, logistics hubs, and internal symbols of authority could be added to the strike list. And once that chain reaction begins, Iran lacks the strategic depth to absorb the shock. The greatest danger isn't military defeat. It's a cascading collapse of internal trust in a society already fatigued by long years of sanctions and crisis. There's another factor, less often discussed but just as critical: isolation. Iran has partners, and there are quiet voices that support its resistance to Western pressure. But that support is fragile and conditional. A single shot could cause those partners to immediately step back, not out of betrayal, but out of fear of being pulled into an open conflict. In that moment, Iran would realize that deterrence isn't just about military posture. It's about diplomacy, economics, and preserving at least some degree of global sympathy. Here lies the central paradox. Iran's most effective strike might be the one it never delivers. Its mere ability to cause instability, to force its adversaries to ask questions and stay on high alert, is enough to prolong its bargaining space. If the US has to weigh every move, divert attention and resources, then Iran has already achieved part of its survival goal. Firing first would end that game. By holding back, Iran retains control over the tempo of tension. This restraint, then, isn't a sign of weakness. It's the expression of a deep fear of losing control. Iran walks a tightrope, where every step must be carefully measured to avoid crossing the line into strategic suicide. And it is precisely this tightly coiled tension that worries the world most. Because when one side can neither fire nor retreat, all eyes turn to the fallout if the balance suddenly tips. From the Persian Gulf, ripples of anxiety spread beyond the region. Energy markets, regional and global allies, major powers watching from the sidelines, all are tuned to the faintest signals. A single shot here isn't just a matter between Iran and the US. It could set off a chain reaction on a global scale. And in this breathless atmosphere, the story must now expand beyond Iran's horizon, to examine what the world is preparing for and why the entire international system is holding its breath. As tensions rise in the Persian Gulf, the real fear doesn't lie in what's happening, but in what could spiral beyond control. This isn't an isolated hotspot. It's a pressure point for global energy, commerce, and confidence. All it takes is a single misread signal, a small incident misunderstood, and the entire system behind it could begin to shake in ways no one can stop in time. For Gulf nations, the fear isn't just about security, it's about the heartbeat of their economies. Oil isn't merely a commodity, it's a promise of stability. When the Strait of Hormuz is threatened, the market doesn't wait for a shot to be fired. The mere possibility of disruption sends prices soaring, insurance premiums spiking, and supply chains recoiling. Economies that depend on energy exports know they're facing a paradox. No one wants war, yet the shadow of it alone is enough to erode the certainty they rely on to survive. On the other side, major energy-consuming nations view the Gulf like a pressure valve. A malfunction here doesn't just raise fuel prices. It ignites inflation, shakes financial markets, and increases domestic political pressure. When oil prices rise, everything follows: transport costs, food prices, public discontent. These consequences don't take months to unfold. They appear swiftly, spread widely, and are hard to reverse. For military powers, this tension presents a difficult dilemma of commitments and limits. Deep involvement risks being pulled into an unwanted spiral. Staying out risks leaving a strategic space in limbo. The increased presence isn't just about deterring adversaries. It's also about reassuring allies who are quietly asking whether security promises still hold their value when risks escalate. At a deeper level, the impact becomes psychological and global. The world has grown accustomed to seeing power expressed through overwhelming technology and dominance. But the scenario unfolding in the Persian Gulf reveals an unsettling truth. Even the most advanced systems can be challenged by asymmetry, by sheer numbers, and by threats that refuse to follow the familiar script. When trust and control begins to wobble, markets and politics react with excessive caution, sometimes turning fear into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then there are the countries on the sidelines, not directly involved but far from indifferent. They observe, calculate, and prepare for scenarios they hope won't come to pass. Every move in the Gulf is scrutinized through the lens of national interest, from maritime security to strategic balance. In this atmosphere, silence is no longer a void. It's tense anticipation, where everyone knows that a single misstep could trigger a chain reaction. That's why the world is holding its breath, not because war has started, but because it's so close and yet not crossed. In this precarious in-between, every action is amplified, every signal overanalyzed. And when the entire global system is stretched tight like a wire, the question is no longer who will win, but whether anyone is clear-headed enough to keep the wire from snapping. Looking back at the full picture, what lingers isn't the question of what Iran can do or how powerful the US truly is. What's more thought-provoking is how deterrence itself has changed shape. In today's world, power is no longer defined solely by the number of weapons, missile range, or the sophistication of warships. It lies in the ability to control the tempo of tension, to force the opponent to hesitate, recalculate, and remain in a state of prolonged vigilance. The Persian Gulf reveals an unsettling paradox of the high-tech age. The more advanced a military system becomes, the more it depends on order, precise information, and predictable scenarios. And it's that very dependence that opens up space for asymmetric strategies, where ambiguity becomes a weapon. Iran doesn't need to win to survive. It only needs to prevent its adversary from being sure it will win. When absolute confidence is eroded, deterrence shifts from a posture of imposition to one of implicit negotiation. This also raises a broader question for the international order. If even the strongest symbols of power can be challenged without a decisive battle, then where do the limits of power truly lie? Perhaps in this new era, the side that goes furthest isn't the one with the most advanced arsenal, but the one that best understands the line between applying pressure and triggering self-destruction. Iran is playing a dangerous game, but it's that very danger that exposes the limits of every actor involved. On the other side, the US still holds unmatched military strength, but that strength now faces a harder question: how to maintain deterrence without being pulled into an unwanted spiral of escalation. When every reaction can be interpreted, when every move carries global consequences, power becomes less about certainty and more about irresponsibility. And perhaps that's why the story of Iran and the USS Abraham Lincoln is not the prologue to war, but a warning. A warning about a world where war can unfold without a single shot fired. A world where prolonged tension becomes the new normal. And a world where restraint, not destruction, becomes the true measure of strategic resolve. If you've stayed with us this far, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Iran is truly prepared to cross the line, or are they simply buying time in a long survival game? And if you value slow, deep, and unsensational analysis, subscribe to the channel to keep following the geopolitical stories quietly shaping the world around us.